record and share my computer. There we go. Bingo. Okay. Once again, can I just get a thumbs up or a yes? Do you see my PowerPoint presentation? Awesome.
Yes.
Thank you, Christine. All right. So non-contingent offers the risk for buyers and sellers. Before I do that, let me close the sliding glass door. Hold on one second. I don't want any interruptions whatsoever. Last. It's an age of same time. You have a minute. They don't see that I have a computer, a camera right in front of me, and I'm speaking out loud to myself. You would think, right? They would know I'm teaching a class.
Hey, Simon, can I ask a
Yes.
question before you go into your thing? Is your office using, we have a contingent free offer advisory, KW. Are you guys using that for, it's an office addendum?
Yeah,
You are, okay, a version of it.
yeah.
Okay, thank
Yeah,
you.
was that provided by the legal team or by Rich Pisani?
Oh, well, it came to me from Rich, but probably legal team, but it came from it. Ours is specific to KW Calabasas, so I'm sure you guys have it, you know. Yeah, it came from
Yeah.
Luxury International, but Rich.
Right, 100%. Well, and I'm putting this disclaimer out there that obviously because we share our training calendar, I always advise that you must speak with your broker in order for any contract related questions. This is a generic class, you know, and always speak with your broker regarding any questions you have, because the policies and procedures may be a little different than what you're accustomed to, if that makes sense. Okay. All right, let's go ahead and continue. So what is non-contingent offers? Well, let's talk about the balancing the risk in a hot market. You know, now we're starting to see a little bit of a shift, right? We didn't see this 6-7 months ago. That's when market was super hot. Listings would pop up, and before you know it, 2-3 days, property was already pending or in escrow. So it's a very competitive for the buyers. Now, when you have very low inventory, right? Lots of buyers, qualified buyers, but very low amount of homes for sale. This is where you have the hot market, where we call it a seller's market, okay? Well, what is a seller's market? Meaning that the sellers can cherry pick what they want. When there's a flip and a switch is when we call now a buyer's market. What does that mean? Well, lots of homes for sale, but very few buyers that qualify. Maybe it's because of the interest rate. Okay, interest rates go up. Buyers tend not to qualify, so it makes it a whole lot different for buyers to qualify for a loan. And this is the reason we see a shift in sellers into buyers. And that's where there's a lot of homes. And because there's far and few buyers, now the buyers have a little bit of control. Whereas the seller's market, the sellers dictate, the sellers control the narrative of this particular process. Why? They have 5, 10, 15 different offers, and they can see all the different layers of offers, the price, terms, and conditions, right? And that's beneficial to the seller, because now you can say, well, I'll sell it to you if you're willing to go up on the price. I'll sell it to you if you're willing to release a contingency. I'll sell it to you if you are to reduce your time frame in order to close. That's the difference between a seller's market that allows the control of the seller to ultimately pick and choose and send out what's called a multiple counteroffer. And then these offers come back with the favorable terms. Okay, but there's also a risk when it comes to seller's market, because the buyer now is exposing what? Their deposit. They're risking their deposit that's in escrow. So in a competitive market, buyers need to balance the desire for making an offer more attractive, right? with the risk of waiving certain or all contingencies. Now, let me ask you this question. Can a buyer release any and all upfront? Submit an offer and already release everything. And when I mean everything, physical inspections, seller's disclosures, appraisal, and also HOAs if there's HOA, and loan contingency, even before the buyer, and even before the seller even accepts the offer. Sure can. All right, Eric, 100%. Yep, the buyer can. And I'm going to show you where that information is on the RPA, why it's crucial and very important, because I want to educate you and have a grasp and an understanding of your position as a buyer's agent. Now, there's two sides of this, right? There's the seller side and obviously the buyer. We're going to interact with both, meaning we're going to talk a little bit like if we are representing the seller, but we're also going to be talking about when we represent the buyer. Now, and the risk factors when working with a buyer. Now, whose job is it to release contingencies? Is it the buyer? Is it the buyer's agent? Is it the seller? Or is it the listing agent? Anyone?
Everyone. Depends on the contingency.
Okay.
Seller or buyer contingency.
Okay. When you say everyone, are you also referring to the agents involved in this transaction?
Well, the agents aren't signing the contingency releases, so only the buyer and seller, but you need to inform them. So I guess I'm taking responsibility on that part of it, but I'm not signing the form.
Okay. Well, it's a valid point and a valid conversation. So the answer is it's the buyer's responsibility. The buyer has to release that as a condition. Remember, whose money is in jeopardy? Okay, the buyer. Now, in good faith, the buyer puts a deposit to secure the property. Mr. and Mrs. Seller, I love your property. I want to submit an offer on your property. And in lieu of securing that property and taking that property off the market, I am willing to put a little skin in the game. Here's my deposit. Now, what is the maximum amount that a buyer can put as a deposit? Anyone? It's not a trick question. Eric, again, you're correct on that. It's a buyer. Okay, so the answer to my question is, it doesn't matter. The buyer can put the entire purchase price as a deposit. It's not what you typically think. I was hoping that someone would say, well, 3%, okay, because that's usually what we see agents do, right? Put up to 3% of the purchase price. Well, that is not correct. The buyer can put whatever amount necessary that they feel comfortable with. Well, that can mean a half of the purchase price. Let's just say, theoretically speaking, we have an offer for 500,000. Okay, well, 500,000 in most areas, it's not going to get you anything. But I'm using this as an illustration and as an example. Okay, so let's say the purchase price is 500,000, and the buyer is willing to put in 250,000 as deposit. Is that allowable? The answer is yes. Is it suggested? Well, I mean, I would say it's a little over, but I can't stop the buyer from doing what they feel and what they want. That's the buyer's discretion. That's the buyer's decision. If the buyer wants to put a deposit, by all means, put the deposit. Okay, and that's fine. Now, the seller can say, look, I don't want to accept your offer if it's going to be 50%. Maybe they just want you to put 3%. Now, the seller also has a little bit of say-so here as well. So you have to also follow the guidance and the direction that the seller wants and the listing agent wants. Now, typically, is that the norm? The answer is no. That is usually not the norm. Typically 10, 20, 30, 40,000 is usually the norm depending on the price. But you cannot say no to a buyer that is willing to put a lot more, because what does it show? It shows interest. It shows that the buyer is serious, and the buyer has the means and the stability to close this deal if they're putting such a large deposit. Now, with that being said, does that mean that the seller can go after the entire deposit, even in excess of 3%? And the answer, it really depends. There's certain things that the seller and the listing agent must do in order for that to happen. And I'll share the example, but also share the form that is necessary in order for the seller to go after more than the 3%. Okay, it's not highly recommended, but if it is and the seller has got damage due to this transaction, then yes, by all means, the seller can go after more than what the initial deposit is in an escrow. Contingencies are what we call safeguards to the buyer's deposit if cancellation is desired. That's the whole purpose. Now, here's the big picture that I want all of you to kind of understand. You know, buyers typically will go in, make the offer, submit the deposit, open escrow, go through the buyer's due diligence, right? Making sure that they get an inspection done on the property and making sure that the buyer is completely satisfied with the overall condition of the property, right? And if the buyer is completely satisfied, then the buyer releases that as a condition. Mr. and Mrs. Seller, I'm fine with the property. Let's continue with the process. Then the seller's disclosures come in. The buyer reviews all the seller's disclosures, doesn't see of any concern whatsoever, and is willing to release that as a condition. And the buyer releases that a condition. Then the appraisal comes in and the property does appraise at asking. Well, there's no sense for the buyer to hold on to the appraisal contingency. It appraised. That means that the lender should be okay to continue with the process of the loan as well. So the buyer will also release that as part of the contingency. Then the final one, which is the most important one, is the loan approval, right? If the buyer cannot get approved for a loan, then why would you release the loan contingency? Okay, because you're jeopardizing your position and you're exposing your buyer's deposit. And I want to caution you as well, as a professional, that all of you on the call are, every individual in here, understand your role, understand your plan of attack. Okay, and what I mean by plan of attack is it's no difference in a plane landing. You know, the plane is not going to go 1,000 miles per hour and think it's going to land safely. It has to do with a lot of components and elements that will ultimately land the plane safely. Well, it's no difference in our position as professionals, the buyer's agents. You want to make sure that you navigate, you educate, you consult with your buyers and understand each and every step of the way on what the pros and cons are with releasing contingencies, okay? And I want to be very crystal clear with everyone on the call, and I thank you for being on this call, is I don't want you to be in a position of liability. Well, my agent, Simon, said to release that, and I did, and ultimately I did not get approved for the loan. Now I'm in jeopardy of losing $20,000 because I have breached the contract and my agent did not explain everything. And now the listing agent and the seller are going after my deposit. We never want to be in that position. This is why it's very important that all of you on this call understand the risk when it comes to releasing contingencies right off the bat. This conversation, this class is all about releasing contingencies in the very beginning when an offer, when an offer is submitted or an offer is, or contingencies are released, as part of the negotiations, seller counter offer, buyer counter offer, and the seller says, well, release this or reduce the time frame to release this contingency, and the buyer does so, and now ultimately it doesn't go the way it should go. Okay, so I caution you, because a contingency, as the presentation states, it's a safeguard, it's a guard. Your money is here, right? The buyer's deposit is here, and there's walls. Every wall that you release, the seller gets closer and closer and closer to retaining that deposit. Now, that's where the element of protection comes in, because just as much as the seller has some certain rights to cancel, the buyer also has certain rights to cancel as well. So I want to make sure that you understand that. You go in with the intent to close, okay? And this is where you come in as a professional explaining that to your buyer. And if the buyer, after doing their due diligence, is not 100% comfortable with the condition of the property, the buyer has rights to cancel. The buyer has right to review any and all material facts, condition of the property. And if they're not happy with those reports or statements that the seller stated on the TDS or the seller questionnaire, the SPQ, then the buyer has the right to exercise paragraph 14B in the purchase agreement to back out of the deal. Or if the appraisal doesn't come in at asking, if it comes in a lot less. Now, let me ask you this question, and everyone seems to chuckle with this, but what if you submit an offer for $1 million and the appraisal comes in at a $1.2 million? Is that a reason to cancel escrow? Let's see, we have an answer here. Edric, okay. Edric says, no, you're 100% correct. So let's say it's the total opposite, right? You submitted an offer at $1 million, but the appraisal came in at $1,200,000. And does the buyer have the right to cancel? The answer is no. That is not a good reason to cancel. I can argue that as a seller, and I can argue that as a listing agent. Hey, you got instant equity. There's really no damage here. There's really no money you lost. You are actually gaining equity on the property. You have instant equity. So I would use that as an argument and say, look, there's no, damage here, and ultimately it appraised. So the answer is correct. It's no to that question. Good job, Edric. All right, let's continue. All right, some of the key buyer contingencies. Obviously, these are the layers of contingencies that are in place. Loan. Will the buyer need a loan for all or even part of the purchase? Okay, well, what if it's a cash deal? Then there's no loan contingency, right? And I'll explain the pros and cons to that. Appraisal. Even if there is no loan, will the buyer still want the property if it appraises significantly below purchase price? Now, even if it's a cash offer, folks, okay, meaning that the buyer has all cash to close the deal, the buyer still has the right to hold on to the appraisal. Just because you're paying cash doesn't mean that the buyer is willing to pay in excess to an appraised value. Okay, I would never, and this is me, I would never pay for an overpriced home. I'm in the real estate industry and business to make money, not lose money. Well, it's the same common sense the buyer would also have when determining the value. Okay, because what if it is an all cash offer, right? All cash, $1 million, and the appraisal comes in at $900,000. Now I can negotiate with the sellers. Look, yeah, I'm putting $1 million, but I put $1 million in good faith that the property would appraise at $1 million. but it appraised at 900,000. Therefore, I want to reduce my purchase price to 900 as what the appraised value states. And the buyer has the right if they have their appraisal contingency in place. If they don't have their appraisal contingency, they released it from the very beginning. Sorry, that's not a good reason to cancel. And you can try to negotiate, but any savvy listing agent is going to understand their position. Well, Simon, you released the appraisal contingencies knowing that there might be a slight chance that the property would not appraise. Okay, it's a risk. The buyer has to make that ultimate decision if they want to or not, but also understand the risk involved when releasing certain contingencies. Inspection. Will the buyer still want the property if an expense or safety related defects is discovered? Think about that. If the buyer is willing to release any inspections, okay, and buys the property, goes into the property, starts evaluating the overall condition and realize, shoot, the property needs a new roof. The foundation is not level. There's plumbing issues, there's electrical issues, there's termite. And that can be a circumstance in a situation that could occur. And the buyer, unfortunately, because the buyer release conditions, may not have a real good reason to come back and say, look, I've been duped here. I've been taken. No, because any judge will see right through all the paperwork. And on the paperwork, it will always say buyer or seller has acknowledged and understands what they're signing off on. It will always say that. Acknowledge, you acknowledge the form, and you also understand what the form is stating. And if you don't understand the form, then why would you release that? Well, Simon said to release it. Well, Simon is not the one buying the property, folks, okay? So I want to make sure that you understand your role and your responsibility. If they ask you, well, Simon, should I release that as a condition? Well, how do you respond to that? How do you handle that objection? Okay, very simple. Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, I appreciate you, needing that advice, but unfortunately, I am not the one buying this property. I am not the one that's going to be making the monthly payments. Okay, and I am in no liberty or position to tell you what to do. You have to tell me what your position is. If you're 100% confident, then you release it under your own direction. And if you're not, this is the time. This is the time that we can ask for some type of credit or negotiation, or this is the time that we can say, squash it, we are canceling. Okay, and all of those are perfectly fine, but as long as it's coming from the buyer, not the agent. Make sense? Everyone on the same page with that? All right. Any questions so far? All right. Inspection contingencies and considerations. The inspection process commonly reveals defects, right? We always encourage all buyers to do what's called the physical inspection, right? Home inspection. Maybe getting a contractor. Maybe you will have a house that has a chimney. Maybe you want to get an electrician to look at the condition of the electrical. Maybe the home was built in the 30s and 40s and maybe not up to par on standards. Okay, the buyer has the right to do any and all inspections. And there's a form on Zip that allows you and your client to do all the necessary inspections. You don't have to say, well, it's only the general home inspection. No, guess what? The buyer can do any and all inspections. Foundation, electrical, plumbing, roof, landscaping, okay, flooring. If the property is on a septic tank, they can get an septic inspection on the property. HOA reviews of the CCNRs and the bylaws. All of those are part of the condition, because I do not want the buyer to come back and say, well, Simon said, okay? And no, I was not picked as a kid. Simon said. All right, the inspection process. If the buyer prepared to accept a significant or costly defect, remember, if the buyer does decide to release a condition, then they are understanding that after the fact, they can't come back and say, well, you know what, I changed my mind. Now, can we force a buyer to buy the property? No, correct. Thank you, Christine. No, we cannot force anyone. It's not like we can get a gun, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, you need to buy this home. Otherwise, no, the buyer doesn't. But the buyer also has to understand there is consequences when going through the initial process. Just as much as the buyer can be damaged, guess what? The seller can also be damaged. And what if this property could have gotten more money and chose your offer, and now you decide to cancel? And what I mean by cancel is in good faith, because again, I want to be very clear that the buyer has the right to cancel. You don't have to buy the property if the property is not in the condition you want. But also want you to understand that if you do go forward with it, you are understanding that the property is satisfaction to you. Okay, so I want to make sure that we're clear on that. 1 second. What options does the buyer have without the inspection contingency when there's defects or significant? Buyer may ask the seller to correct an issue, hoping for an agreement by seller. Buyer may decide to cancel the agreement, but with no contingency, buyer deposit is at risk to cover seller's actual or liquidated damages. Buyer should consider the impact of significant defects that may be too costly for buyer to correct and could impact a future sale in a cooler market. So there's pros and cons to this. Okay, so I want to make sure that if you are working with the buyer that is releasing contingencies right off the bat, or even during the time frame, right? Well, what is the time frame to release certain contingencies? Typically 17 days and 21, right? Loan contingency as we speak right now is 21 days. Come December, loan contingency will go back to 17 days instead of 21 days. So all contingencies will be released in 17 days. Now, doesn't mean that it's set in stone either, folks. Okay, if I say 17, does that mean that it's stuck in 17? No, it can be reduced, but it can also be increased. That's why the RPA gives you the blank space, right? The blank space. Sorry. You hear me okay still? Yes? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello? Oh, okay. Just because a call was coming in, I guess it's connected to my phone, so I apologize. So what I was saying is that, you know, either or, whatever direction is the responsibility of all parties, okay? And I've seen circumstances where the buyer doesn't release no contingencies, closes the deal. How they got away with it is beyond me, but I've seen where the buyer held their contingencies at close of escrow. How about that? How about that, right? And if the buyer at the last minute decided to cancel, the seller unfortunately probably would have lost damages, but there was really not much that the seller could have done to retain that buyer's deposit, because shame on the seller, shame on the listing agent for not going based on the contract. Now the contract is very clear in its position, is what I call the black and white to the contract. It tells you the question and it tells you the answer. That's simple. All you got to do is follow the rules, ladies and gentlemen. That's simple. But guess what? A lot of real estate agents don't follow the rules, right? They always try to find little shortcuts, or they think they know it, and then now they're stuck in a hole trying to get out of this hole. And all they're doing is building that hole deeper and deeper and deeper. Okay. Always check with your broker. Always check with legal as well. Okay. You should have the resources. This is why you pay into your risk management. Now, also, the California Association of Realtors has a member service where they allows the agent or a broker to call them and ask for real estate contract related questions. And that's all part of your membership. Okay. All right, any questions regarding inspection contingencies and considerations? All right, let's talk a little bit about what liquidated damages. The liquidated damages clause is a pre-agreement to the amount of damage seller is entitled to if buyer defaults. Okay, well, what does that mean? It means that if the buyer doesn't go through with the purchase of the property, the seller may have some recourses for damages. Now, the damages can be significant or the damages can be very minor. But the seller would have to argue the fact of I've been damaged. And I'm also going to explain to you the importance of the verbiage that says up to 3%, meaning that the seller doesn't have entitlement to 3%. The contract says up to 3%. So the buyer can now argue with the seller and says, look, what are the significant damages that you incurred during this process that allows you to get up to my 3% of my deposit? And that deposit can be $20,000. So I want to make sure that all of you on this call understand that you are better than most agents out there that are not understanding this. The contract, as I mentioned, is very clear in its position. And it says that the buyer may lose under liquidated damages provision up to 3%. Now, if you're a savvy real estate agent, like I know all of you on the call are, you know that it doesn't mean that 20,000, 30,000 is gone, bye-bye. It means, Mr. and Mrs. Sellers, tell me what damages you incurred. Now, if the seller has significant damages, then the seller can go after the full deposit. Well, I lost a month in payment, right? I had to make a mortgage payment, and because you didn't close on time, I am now out, mortgage payment that I shouldn't have made. The buyer requested this to be done, that to be taken care of, and I spent another $10,000 in good faith that the buyer would perform, and the buyer did not perform. So as much as the buyer can request certain requests of repairs, right? Well, the seller also can say, these are the damages that I wouldn't have incurred if it was never asked upon me to correct. So I want you to understand both sides of the tennis court, because tennis, the back and forth, the buyer and seller is like playing tennis. It's back and forth, okay? If a buyer does not have a contractual excuse to cancel, seller will be entitled to liquidated damages and retain that portion of the buyer's deposit. Now, that portion can be the entire amount, or it can be a significant less amount under the deposit. It all really depends, guys. It really depends on where the buyer and where the seller's mind is at. Liquidated damage is a calculations process, and it's very clear in the contract. So this is how it works. For residentials up to 1 duplex, triplex, or fourplex, the buyer tends to occupy the deposit, buyer intends to occupy, then the deposit does not exceed 3% of the purchase price, is the estimate of damages, meaning that if a buyer is submitting an offer on a residential SFR, a duplex, triplex, or a fourplex, and the buyer tends or will occupy the property, then the maximum that the seller can go after is 3%. Y'all with me on this? Okay. So a question to you is, what if the property is of 5 units? What if the buyer is not intending to occupy the property? Does this provision fall under that category? The answer is no. It doesn't fall under the specifics of this statement. The statement is very clear, up to 4 units, and the buyer must be occupying one of the units or a house itself. If the property sells for more money within 6 months after the breach, buyer may be able to show estimate of damage was not reasonable. Okay. And yeah, remember, it's an argument between all parties. I can argue the fact for the buyer, right? And the buyer may argue the fact on the seller. And the listing agent may argue his facts. But at the end of the day, it's between who? The principals involved in this transaction. The seller that's selling the property and the buyer that's buying the property. Do not get yourself entangled in the chaos of a disputed transaction. You don't need that liability. You don't need the headache. You don't need the stress, folks. Throw it at your broker. Let the broker deal with it. No, and no humor. I understand that sometimes it can be overwhelming, but this is where the support comes in, folks. This is where, brokers do what they do best. I know I have a passion for it as a broker, and I love the chase of the deal, but I also like the disputes of the deals, because I want it in for the win. I want to win it for my agent and for my agent's client. So that's how I see it. Here's an illustration and an example. Let's say that the purchase price on January 1st, and we'll use November 1st, original buyer submitted a $1 million offer with a 3% liquidated damages. That 3% of $1 million, if you do the arithmetic, is what? 30,000. Now, let's say that the deal cancels and now the buyer wants to retain their deposit, but the seller is being stubborn. No, I'm going after the 30,000. It's liquidated damages. The buyer defaulted. The buyer did not go through. I'm going over the total amount. Well, what if the seller puts the property back on the market immediately, gets another offer, okay, and the money is in escrow, the first escrow, right? The money's in escrow. And now December comes, they get another offer. And that offer now is for what it says, $1.1 million. So buyer may argue to the seller and have a gain rather than damages, right? Because the buyer now can claim, well, seller, where are the damages? You actually sold it for more than what I was going to buy it for. So the buyer now can go back and say, there's no damage. You just gain $500,000 more. So the buyer can say and argue that fact. Does that make sense? Okay. But what if it's the other way around? What if the property doesn't sell for $1 million and now sells for 100,000 less? And the seller now gets an offer of 900,000. They try to promote it. They try to do open houses. They try to sell it, but cannot sell it, but for 900,000. Does the seller have recourse now to go after the full 30,000? The answer is yeah. They were damaged. They could have bought this, excuse me, the seller could have sold this property for 100,000 more. But because the buyer breached the contract, is not willing to release the deposit, they had to put the property back on the market. And what they ended up happening was they ended up getting a lower offer and no other offers. So I can see where the seller can claim damages here, and they may be able to go after 30,000 and then some. They can probably say, well, the buyer breached the contract. I want to go after the 30, but I'm also going to go after 70,000. The difference that I could have sold it if this buyer did not come through or did come through, then that could have changed the trajectory of all this process. I hope that kind of makes sense. Okay. So it's the way, it's the scale of weight. Who has more evidence to claim their position? Is it the buyer or is it the seller? All right, so the TDS, better known as the transfer disclosure. Buyer may still have contractual rights to cancel. Yeah, absolutely. And I'll explain how that works. If a buyer is provided with the TDS after offer acceptance, or the TDS is updated, modified during the transaction. So it could be one or two ways, folks. Meaning that if a disclosure is given to you late, or disclosure was modified or updated, then it changes the trajectory of this process. Buyer's statutory right to cancel now, and it's in the contract, within 5 days after delivery of the form via mail, email of the TDS or any updates. So let's just say, for example, okay, you are the buyer's agent, you represent Simon. We go through the motions, we get our offer accepted. And 14 days in, all of a sudden, the buyer's agent and the listing agent, just for some reason, failed to remember there was missing disclosures. And then I reach out, you reach out to the listing agent, hey, what happened to the transfer disclosure or the SPQ? We never got any receipt of that. I'm looking through my emails, I don't have it. Oh my gosh, my transaction coordinator never sent that to you. My sincere apology. I'll have my TC send it out to you immediately. Now, 14 days on a 17-day contingency release means that you have 2 more days to release that as a condition. But because you got the contingency, because you got the disclosures late in the game, what it says here is that now the buyer has an additional 5 days from time of receipt. So 14 days, right? You're in 14 days. 17 days from now is 3 days, 15, 16, 17, you must release physical inspections, right? But because you got that disclosure on the 14th day, the buyer has 5 additional days. So what should have been the 17th day is now 18 and 19. So on the 19th day, the buyer has the right to cancel. And if the buyer doesn't cancel, then the seller will have to send what's called a notice to perform. And that allows the buyer an additional 48 hours. So what should have been 19, now it's 20, 21 to release that as a condition. Better yet, if the disclosure was given to you late, the buyer may be able to back out of the deal, even after releasing that as a condition, folks. So let's just say, as an example, you represent me, Simon. We review all the disclosures, but we did not get the transfer disclosure. And somehow we all dropped the ball, and I released that as a contingency. And then later, the listing agent reaches out to you. Oh my gosh, I totally forgot to release or excuse me, I've totally forgot to give you the transfer disclosure. I'm going to have my transaction coordinator send that to you immediately. And you get it, and now you give it to me, and I look at it and my eyes just pop open. It's like, oh my gosh, what did I just get myself into? I did not know that there is a barking dog who's my neighbor that barks 24/7. I did not know that the property is near a train track. I did not know that the property falls under an industrial area and there's constant noise 24/7. If I would have known this, I would have probably not bought the property. What are my recourses here? I just released that as a condition. It's not my fault that the listing agent did not provide me with this disclosure. What is the recourse here? What is the buyer's position? What is my position here? Okay. Well, the buyer has the right to all material facts, right? Anything regarding the property, that is part of the process. And if the buyer did receive these disclosures late in the game, the buyer has an additional 5 days, even though the buyer did release that as a condition. Guess what I can do? I can cancel based on the new relevant information, because this is new material that I was not aware of. Now I can argue the fact and be able to back out of the deal and still retain my deposit, because this is all new to me. Does that make sense? Okay, so I want to make sure that you all understand your role and the importance. Now I'm going to throw a question at you. When must a seller provide you with all disclosures? Anyone? Yes. Christine?
I was trying to type.
Were you going to say something?
I was going to say 7 days or whatever your contract is.
Okay.
I have to look at my RPA right now. But yeah, 7 days. I have a question regarding that, because it's funny. I get it about the TDS, but if you have physical inspections and reports, 14 days, and even though you got the TDS, but you didn't do anything about it within the 5 days, it's part of your inspections and reports. If you still didn't release the physical inspections, you're still okay, correct? Unless you
Correct.
got a notice to perform, but I've never gotten a notice to perform just for that part for TDS, right?
Right. Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Remember, this only falls if you, and then what I mean by you, your buyer releases this as a condition. If that's the case, then yeah, if this is new relevant information, then the buyer can argue the fact and say, look, you know, I wouldn't have bought this property if I would have known this new information. Okay. So it's very, very crucial, very important. So I have a question that just came in. When you take the listing, so here's my theory on this. Okay. When should you have seller start doing all the seller disclosures? At time of acceptance, or prior to even getting an offer in consideration?
As early as you can.
100%. The sooner the better. The sooner the better. Why? Is because you don't want to be that agent that waits last minute and now the sellers are dragging their feet and now they're pressed for time and they don't send the disclosures on a timely manner. So I just want to make sure that you understand that the sooner, the most practical time frame is the sooner the better. Get them done. You go on the listing appointment and they say, you know what, Simon, I think you're the right fit to sell my home. Wonderful. You know, part of the initial process, there's seller's disclosures that I need to start preparing. You know, my transaction coordinator will be sending you all these disclosures to you shortly, because now you have everything. And when the buyer gets into escrow, that's when the time starts. And that's when you can immediately send those over to the buyer. So that way the buyer is aware of everything that they have in front of them. And what they have in front of them, now they can make a determination, yay to go forward, yay to negotiate with the seller, request the repairs, or heck, you know what? I just don't want to deal with it. Let's just go ahead and cancel. Now, the pros and cons to these situations. We're talking about non-contingent, meaning what if the buyer released these right off the bat, right in the beginning? That's going to be a very determined position. Now, here's the pros and cons to this that I want to make sure you understand. Because even though the buyer can release any and all right from the very beginning, they submit the offer, they submit the CR, right, the contingency removal, and checking off, buyer has released any and all contingencies. Okay. And if the buyer releases any and all contingencies, and now 5 days later, right, gets their disclosures, and they realize, oh my gosh, I just bought this property that is haunted. Is that a good reason for the buyer to back out of the deal? Well, seller didn't get the disclosures till later. Buyer released that as a condition. What do you think the answer to that question is? Okay, think about that. Well, the answer is, so be it. Oh, well, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, you knew when you acknowledged and you understood that by releasing that as a condition, that you knew what you were getting yourself into. It's not my fault that, you know, you released all content. I didn't force you. I didn't put a gun to your head. You decided to choose that as part of the initial negotiations. You wanted this property. I'm sorry that, you know, per the contract, 5 days after acceptance, the seller must provide you those disclosures. And, you know, part of the disclosures states that there is a ghost in the house. Oh, well, that is not a good reason for the buyer to retain their deposit. Now, the buyer can cancel. Don't get me wrong. Remember what I said earlier. The buyer can cancel. There's nothing you can do that. You cannot force the buyer to purchase the property, but also what you can do is say, okay, no problem. We'll put the property back on the market, but that money stays with the seller. Okay, that's simple, folks. So understand your position. Any questions? Okay, well, the answer is right here. Buyer has statutory right to cancel within 5 days after delivery of the TDS. Buyer has statutory right to cancel within 3 days after delivery in person of the TDS or update. Okay. All right, consideration for seller. Always verify buyer has sufficient funds for purchasing the property. If all cash or down payment, the buyer getting a loan, best to verify before accepting the offer 100%. Don't be that agent that goes with the motion just because they're the highest possible offer. You got to look at all elements to this, guys. You got to look at, okay, yeah, price, terms, and condition. But you also want to verify that this buyer is solid. I am not going to accept the buyer if they're releasing the appraisal contingency. Now we have a discrepancy of $20,000, $30,000, but their proof of funds doesn't show but enough for the down payment and closing cost. Because there's no way a buyer is going to buy this property, and they're going to fight you tooth and nail and say, look, I don't have the money. So you can go after me, but I don't have the money. So be very careful. Look at all the elements to this buyer. And that would be one of my first key. They're putting a 20%. Well, based on down payment of 20% and closing costs, it looks like about $40,000 they're going to need. But I'm a little hesitant that it may not appraise. So I'm going to factor another $30,000 just in case. So if I don't see at least 80, 100,000 in their bank account or some form of funds, I'm going to second guess these buyers that maybe that's not the right direction to go, because what's going to happen is it's going to fall out of escrow. So look at all their financial, folks. Okay, very, very important. Look at their financials. Any questions regarding that? Significant valuation differences in appraisal may still lead buyers to cancel or risk a dispute.
Your appointment to meet this year.
Oh, okay, cool. All right, my appointment is here, folks, so I apologize. Significant defects discoveries may still lead buyers to cancel and risk dispute. The TDS provides, or an updated after offer will give the buyer a statutory right to cancel. Consideration for seller. Deposits are not automatically released to a seller even if the buyer does not perform. Disputes are costly in time and money, 100%. Disputes may keep seller's property off market during resolution of dispute. Disgruntled buyer increased possibility of legal claims. Again, if there's a dispute, people are going to roll up their sleeve and they're going to pound and huff and argue. You don't want to be in that chaos of that mess. So be very, very careful when a buyer does want to release all contingencies right off the back. And it may not be all, it may be certain ones. I caution you, because your clients are working against the broker's advice. We as brokers never encourage any buyer to release any contingencies off the bat. We don't recommend it, because we know the liability that will incur because of that. But can we force the buyer to say no to that? The answer is no. They want the property, and they may have to be in a bidding war with other offers. And part of the condition is, look, buyer A, buyer B are willing to do so. Do you want to play or not? And if you're not, then you may not get the property. But if you are the winning bid, also caution your clients that if they decide to cancel, they may also be in jeopardy of their deposit. Again, disputes are costly in time and money. And believe me, I've been through a lot of mediations, arbitrations, and they can drag for hours. The most recent one that I was involved in was several years back, and it was out on the west side. Beautiful building. That's where we're going to have our mediation. And we represented the seller on this, and the buyer and the buyer's agent and the buyer's attorney were there, and we were there as the broker, and also the seller and the listing agent and our legal department as well, our attorneys. And they told us, well, it should be a couple hours. Well, I thought a couple hours. Well, guess what? I was there at 10 o'clock in the morning. I did not leave till 10 o'clock in the evening. Literally 12 hours. I was so anxious. I was so frustrated. And there's really not much you can do, because you're just going through the motions back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Okay. So do you want to deal with all that? No. You just want to go help buyers, help sellers. That's your job. Not to be in these legality circumstances. It's not worth it. Okay. And obviously there's additional resources that you can pull up with the California Association of Realtors. All right, so let me just quickly show you something real quick. All right, so this is the RPA under 14, right? 14A, 14B. Now under 14, 14C is in Charles. You see this on the bottom? This is where the buyer has the right to release certain contingencies immediately. And this is what it says, the following. removal of contingency. So if you check that little box, what the buyer is saying is, buyer removes the contingencies specified in the attached CR form. If buyer removes any contingencies without an adequate understanding of the property's condition or buyer's ability to purchase, buyer is acting against the advice of who? The brokerage, the broker. That's simple. But it allows the buyer to understand if they are willing to release as a condition, they have the right to. But if they do not get what they want and ultimately they decide to cancel, be aware that they may lose their deposit. That's it. Now, if a buyer goes through the whole process, closes the deal, congratulations. Everyone gets what they want. The buyer gets the property, the seller sells the property, and the agents involved get the commission. Okay, it's a win-win for everyone. Okay, but if the buyer, after releasing certain contingencies, you cannot use that as an avenue. You can't release an appraisal contingency and say, well, the lender will not give me the loan because it did not appraise. Well, the contract is very, very clear. It says that I think under loan contingency or appraisal contingency, let me go back to that section. So appraisal contingency and removal. This agreement is not contingent upon a written appraisal of the property by a licensed certified appraisal and no less than the purchase price. Buyer shall, as specified in paragraph 14B3, in writing, remove that as a condition or cancel this agreement within 17 days. I know there's a section here. Buyer shall, as specified in 14 in writing, remove the loan contingency. If there is an appraisal contingency removed of the loan contingency, shall not be deemed remove of the appraisal contingency. There it is. Loan contingency obtained, any loan specified above is not contingent of this agreement. If buyer does not obtain the loan, as a result does not purchase the property, seller may be entitled to what? Buyer's deposit or legal remedies. Okay, it's very clear, folks. Very, very clear. Here's the loan contingency paragraph. Buyer shall act diligent in good faith to obtain the designated loan. Buyer's qualification for the loan specified above is a contingency of this agreement unless otherwise agreed in writing. If there is no appraisal contingency or the appraisal contingency has been waived or removed, then failure of the property to appraise at the purchase price does not entitle buyer to exercise the cancellation right. There it is, folks. So if you release appraisal, you cannot use that as a recourse. I cannot get the loan. The buyer is going to have to come in with the difference or jeopardize a portion of the buyer's deposit. That clear, folks, that clear. Let me also share with you what the contingency removal shows or looks like, okay? So this is what they're talking about, the contingency removal. So obviously you would check off purchase agreement, and here is, where the buyer would remove any and all. Buyer hereby removes any and all. If you remove this, then you're eliminating all defense to the deposit, the guard that protects the buyer's deposit. Now, the buyer has to understand by doing so, they may be exposing their deposit. So I want to caution you and your client, by doing so, you're working against the broker's advice. Now, if the buyer wants to do it, that's on them. But also understand that by doing so, they may lose their deposit. Now, if they check off this one here, right? All buyer contingency are removed except, then you can keep the loan, you can keep the appraisal, you can keep the buyer's purchase or sale of their property, whatever that, or even HOAs as well as a protection. I'll release everything else, but I still want to hold on to the loan, hold on to the appraisal. We haven't got the appraisal yet. So that's what it means. All right. Any questions?
Hey, Simon, I have a question. On that contingency release where you're picking the ones that you're releasing or not, which ones you're holding on to. I have a deal that has a little issue with title, but I'm ready to release physical and appraisal and HOA and all that. Would you put that there, like as a handwritten? Because there isn't one there for title, so I could just releases all except for loan and title.
100%. Very good question. Thank you, Christine. Yes, be specific. You're releasing all these conditions, but we still haven't received certain thing. Put it there as a condition. Because if it doesn't come or it's not favorable to the buyer, we can use this as a defense and say, look, I put this as a condition. We wanted to move forward, but we didn't receive this just yet. But after receiving it, buyer is not comfortable with it. We are not going to go forward with the purchase. That's your defense. Then you can argue and say, I'm pulling out, I'm canceling, but I'm also, as a layer, as a wall, we're protecting the buyer's deposit. Okay. Very good question. All right. Any other questions? All right. Well, I hope that this information was informative to you. And again, if you have any questions, please reach out to your broker, or better yet, you can also reach out to me as well. Let me see how I can do this. All of you should have my email. It's Simon, S-I-M-O-N, last name Cazares, C-A-Z-A-R-E-S @kaw.com.
Thanks,
Let me
Simon.
see if, thank you. Thank you. Appreciate you all. Have a phenomenal rest of your afternoon, and I'll see you on the next class, okay? Take care. Bye for now.
Thank you, Simon.
Hey, thank you. I
You're
didn't know you were on the
amazing.
call.
Yeah, I told you I was going to be on the call.
I was looking for Nina, so.
Stop it.
Awesome.
You have a blessed, dry rest of the day.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Stay safe.
All right. All right,
Bye,
sweetie.
Simon.
Take care.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Bye.